In 1895, Japan decisively usurped dominance in Asia from China's Qing dynasty, but after winning the war, the Japanese lost the peace. The Russian Empire, backed by Germany and France, forced Japan to return the Liaodong Peninsula to the Qing, and roughly 5 minutes later, Russia forced the Chinese to lease them the peninsula's most valuable port and moved to check Japanese influence in Korea. Infuriated at their treatment by the Europeans, Japan began plotting revenge, and 10 years later, things would go very differently. So, how did Japan become the first Asian country to triumph over a European power in the industrial age? Why did Japan win the Russo-Japanese War? Japan was uniquely successful in adopting foreign know-how as European empires gobbled up swathes of Asia in the 19th century. The forced opening of the country to foreigners by the American Perry expedition after hundreds of years of isolation in 1853 shook Japan's shogun and samurai system to its core. But unlike in China, set to endure a century of humiliation at European hands, in Japan, exposure to the West kicked off a social revolution, the Meiji Restoration. By remodeling their political system and military along Western lines, Japan became powerful. Feudal Japan was torn down and rebuilt as a modern nation-state in just a few decades. Everything from Western sciences to fashion was in vogue, and the Japanese were eager to emulate Europe in other ways too, namely by conquering an overseas empire of their own, and the obvious place to start was neighboring Korea. Korea and nearby Manchuria could fuel Japanese industrialization as rich sources of raw materials. Both were ruled by China. That wouldn't be a problem after 1895, but Russia's acquisition of Port Arthur and its budding sphere of influence and rail network in Manchuria, an extension of the Russian Trans-Siberian Railway, posed a direct threat to Japanese ambition. Their Russian problem was twofold. Firstly, Japanese leaders needed to avoid a repeat of the triple intervention of 1895, when they were forced to back down or be overwhelmed by multiple great powers simultaneously. Prime Minister Ito Hirobumi had sent out feelers to St. Petersburg proposing recognition of Russian influence in Manchuria in exchange for Russia accepting Japanese rule in Korea. That didn't go anywhere, so Ito and his successor in Tokyo turned to the Tsarist autocracy's greatest rival, the British Empire. As the world's foremost power, an alliance with Britain would isolate the Russians by ensuring the neutrality of other Europeans in any conflict. Britain and Russia were imperial adversaries in Central Asia, and the British were open to relations with Japan, provided they didn't have to do too much. Secondly, if there was to be war with Russia, the Japanese needed to fight it soon. Tsar Nicholas II could raise far more soldiers than Japan could ever hope to, but the bulk of Russia's army and industry were in the West. The Trans-Siberian Railway would soon change that, but it was still under construction, setting a hard numerical limit on what could be transported east, for the time being. The Anglo-Japanese alliance of 1902 stipulated that if either country became at war with multiple great powers, the other would join on their allies' side. That had the effect of deterring France from fighting the coming war with their Russian allies. It allowed Britain to focus on threats closer to home, and it gave Japan security assurances. The Japanese had a fleet of modern warships, many purchased from British shipyards, and an officer corps with experience from the conflict with China. The Russian Navy boasted more heavy vessels, but they were aging, and the Tsar's commanders tended to be promoted by court favor before competence. On the 8th of February 1904, 3 hours before an official declaration of war, the Imperial Japanese Navy under Admiral Togo Heihachiro struck the Russian Far Eastern Fleet at anchor in Port Arthur. In St. Petersburg, the initial attack was met with shock, but confident that the Japanese had neither the material nor the metal to last in a protracted fight, Nicholas II sent his Minister of War to mount Manchuria's defense. In the coming months, the Japanese army seized Korea, effectively ending its independence, and more Japanese landed on the Liaodong Peninsula to besiege the trapped Far Eastern Fleet. The Russians met them on the Korean border. Each belligerent would field more than 1 million men in the east over the course of the war, but with the unfinished Trans-Siberian Railway limiting deployments, Russia could only field its forces at full capacity by the summer of 1905. By then, it was too late. Russian commanders, conscious of their supply issues, were naturally cautious and held up well against Japanese attacks, but they also failed to exploit the fact that Japan was similarly stretched to the limit. Critically, Russia failed to fortify defensible mountain positions and the Yalu River in northern Korea. To retake the early initiative for Russia, Admiral Stepan Makarov had attempted to break out of Port Arthur. His ultimate hope would have been to join with reinforcements in Vladivostok. Instead, he rushed a small fleet out of harbour, ran into 6 battleships under Togo, and promptly turned around, only to sail his flagship into a Japanese mine and sink to the bottom. The incensed Tsar ordered that ships be redeployed from the Baltic. The land war consisted of a grueling Japanese advance fighting up the Russian rail network in southern Manchuria. Port Arthur fell in January 1905. The Tsar's imprisoned Far Eastern fleet was blown to pieces by land-based artillery. Japan became free to advance unhindered, and the two sides met at the Battle of Mukden in March. At over 600,000 total combatants, Mukden was the largest industrial-era battle before the First World War. The capture of the city, modern Shenyang, by the Japanese opened up all of Manchuria to potential conquest. At sea, the Baltic fleet had arrived in theatre after an 18,000 nautical mile journey around Africa. The crew were demoralized, unaccustomed to the climate, and their ships ravaged by months without proper maintenance. In the process of getting to the east, the fleet had nearly started a war with Britain by firing on British North Sea fishermen that the Russians mistook for Japanese torpedo boats. Against the real Japanese, the Baltic fleet proved pretty pointless. Port Arthur fell before it reached the east, and it ended up fighting just one engagement. In May 1905, in the Straits of Tsushima between Japan and Korea, the Baltic fleet was trapped and annihilated by Admiral Togo. As early as mid-1904, Japanese leadership had been formulating plans to end the war on their own terms. The battles of Mukden and Tsushima, they then concluded, had proved their superiority on both land and sea, and Japan was ready to consolidate their gains. The Harvard-educated Count Kaneko Kentaro was sent to Washington to persuade Theodore Roosevelt to mediate peace talks. When Russia demurred, Japan invaded Sakhalin Island in July 1905. Meanwhile, the Russian Revolution of 1905 had broken out in February after a massacre in St. Petersburg. Nationwide strikes and peasant uprisings meant that Nicholas II could no longer afford a humiliating and increasingly costly war, and sent his former finance and future prime minister, Sergei Witt, who had headed the Trans-Siberian Rail project, to negotiate in the United States. The Treaty of Portsmouth, signed in September 1905, won Roosevelt a Nobel Peace Prize. More importantly, it marked a major geopolitical victory for Japan. Russia recognized Japan's paramount influence in Korea, which was soon turned into a formal protectorate and later annexed outright in 1910. Japan was also awarded the lease to Port Arthur, Russia ceded half of Sakhalin, and Tokyo gained control of the South Manchuria Railway Zone, strategic prizes that cemented its new status as a great power in East Asia. The Japanese won in 1905 principally because the Meiji generation was unafraid of taking the initiative. A reform at home was reflected in the capacity of the Japanese armed forces and spurred Imperial Japan's readiness to act like a global power even before it had fully become one. Of course, Japan's outlook would pivot dramatically in the coming decades, and Russia would eventually modernize at the cost of far more chaos. To find out more about that, and the next war lost by Tsar Nicholas, you should check out the video to the left on Russia in World War I. If you enjoyed this one, it should be right up your alley. And as always, I've been James, and thanks for watching Look Back History.